So now I would like to introduce the panel discussion that we're now going to have on Lewy body. We have Kevin Quaid, who's the author of Lewy Body Dementia Survival in Me. He's the vice chair of the European Dementia Working Group and co-founder and chair of Lewy Body Ireland. Then we have Helena Quaid. She's the chair of the DCCN Dementia Carers Campaign Network and also vice chair of Lewy Body Ireland. We've got Professor Iracema Leroi. She's the associate professor of geriatric psychiatry, faculty member of the Global Brain Health Institute, and co-founder and director of Lewy Body Ireland. Then we have Karen Meenan, who's the co-founder and director of Lewy Body Ireland, as well as a senior Atlantic fellow for equity in brain health at the Global Brain Health Institute. And then we've got Caoimhe Tyndall, who's a PhD candidate at Trinity College Dublin, and Ken Greaney, who's co-founder and director of Lewy Body Ireland. Maybe we'll start with Kevin. Kevin, do you want to maybe give us some background into Lewy Body Ireland and how this all started?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I've been told I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to cut it short. You all know my story by now, and Francesca just mentioned fear, and the importance of Lewy Body Ireland cannot be stressed enough, because I'll tell you why. Everyone looks for the lived experience. Well, this is my lived experience in the past 2 months from 2 hospitals that I have visited on numerous occasions. I need to start by telling you that the people in the hospital, from the cleaners right up to the surgeons, are wonderful people, wonderful staff. And this is not a snipe at them. Far from it, far from it. They're people that have kept us alive during the pandemic. They have done so much good. But unfortunately, as a person with Lewy body dementia, I now have to take it for granted that when I go in, they have no idea what Lewy body dementia is, that they have never heard of it. The 13th of September, I have serious bladder and bowel problems. Constipation is a major red flag for my type of dementia, and I do believe so are urinary tract problems and all that, which I have both. And I went to the urologist, and a lovely, lovely person, but the person working with them, I talked to them, they said Lewy body dementia, they told me they'd never heard of it. I was in theatre last Tuesday week. A surgeon, a junior doctor, and 2 nurses. Beautiful, beautiful people, trying to make me as comfortable, trying to make my life as easy as possible. And they said to me, the junior doctor and the 2 nurses, that they had never heard of Lewy body dementia. One asked me how you pronounce it. One asked me, how do you spell it? I think of Ken Greaney, then his dad, Dave, who's 6 years further on his journey than I am. And if Dave is inside the theatre and Dave is lying down, and Dave says he has Lewy body dementia, and they tell him that they don't know what it is, that they have never heard of it. Our fear skyrockets when you hear that. Mine does. So you can imagine what happens to Dave. And as I said, I am not here to have a pop at anyone in the hospitals or anything. But it's all about training nurses. It's all about training healthcare professionals. We have so many on here today and yesterday and the day before, and it's wonderful, and they know about it. But there should be a module, a specific module covering dementia. I even think it should start at secondary schools, but definitely in college. And if you're going to go into the area that has to do with the bowel or the bladder, I don't know these technical problems, but anything that causes red flags, good God, you should know what diseases you're talking about. Just picture a man sitting down this morning and a lovely nurse putting cannula into his arm. And he turns around and he says, "This is my 6th dose of chemotherapy for prostate cancer. And if the nurse turned around and said, prostate cancer, how do you spell that? Or how does that affect you? How would that person feel? That is exactly what it is like for Kevin Quaid, who has Lewy body dementia and who is full of fear. So Lewy Body Ireland is set up in that when the likes of Kevin and Helena will go in to a neurologist or a professional like Iracema, that she can say, there's a leaflet, there's the website, there's the information. In Lewy Body Ireland, you will be able to hear from carers, from people like me, from medical people, from people with the arts, from everyone involved and that knows about Lewy body. We have started. Helena and myself have spoken to Royal College of Surgeons, we've spoken to pharmacists, we've gone out of our way to talk in colleges to student nurses and that. It is getting better, it is improving, but I am talking about today. I'll go in again next Wednesday to have a procedure done, and I know I'm going to be asked, what is Lewy body dementia? So that is why Lewy Body Ireland is so important. Thanks.
Very good, Kevin. So now I will turn it over to Helena, who you mentioned is your partner in crime.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Leroi and Karen Meenan for all the work they have done and for the wonderful seedling that they have set. And it's absolutely wonderful to be part of Lewy Body Ireland. It fills me with hope and optimism for the future. And I really believe it's going to be like the lighthouse in the storm that is living with Louie. I believe LBD, with its many symptoms, such as fluctuations and REM sleep behavior disorder, can be like our Irish weather, 4 seasons in one day. Nights are definitely can be very gloomy and clouds can descend rapidly. But then the sunshine arrives with the light of day. And on a bad day, you know, when I was young, I would often hear my dad say when he would come in from the farm seeking shelter, it's down for the day. Anyone living with Lewy bodies will certainly know what I mean, as we both have seen many a down day. As Kevin's wife, I also live with Louie, and I can sometimes feel weathered and worn by the long and repeated exposure to lack of sleep. Therefore, I am now very mindful of the effects of spousal caring on my own health and well-being. I now accept that I am powerless over this disease. I cannot control what cannot be controlled. And it is essential that I do take care of myself. We are very lucky in that we have a great medical team, and we are very thankful that Kevin got an early and correct diagnosis at age 53, having been diagnosed with Parkinson's 2 years earlier. It may be hard to believe, but there is actually a relief in knowing, as we could then identify the problems and try to find solutions as best we could, all the while making the best of a bad situation. Of course, there are times when there seems to be no solution and nothing seems to work. Then I have to dig deep and hope that my resilience is there, my reservoir of resilience has not already drained away, ending up like a dry riverbed in an extreme drought. Research tells us that 60% of caregivers show signs of clinical depression, and caregivers take more prescription medications, including those for anxiety and depression, than others in their age group. Since Kevin's diagnosis, I have learned that LBD is like a meandering stream with many twists and turns. I am lucky that Kevin lives by the motto, never give up. And we both live in the hope that one of these days the tide will turn. And Lewy Body Ireland is the hope of that. We support each other, you know, to live in hope as we face the daily challenges of LBD. And I would have to say that I'm an optimist at heart. And as I like to rhyme, I will finish up with these few words. Concentrate on the positives in life, finding happiness along the way. While life is full of ups and downs, we can only hope and pray. Thank you. Gurmagid.
Lovely, Helena. So now I'm going to turn it over to Karen.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Lewy Body Ireland. So Kevin is front and centre of Lewy Body Ireland. He is our inspiration every day. Helena is our inspiration, as is Ken, who you're going to hear from later. His dad, Dave, wasn't as lucky as Kevin. He had a diagnosis much later in his life. There are other members. There are 23 people in Lewy Body Ireland. One of our members, her mother waited for 15 years to get a diagnosis. So when people ask us, why are we so committed? Why do we do all this? Nobody should wait 15 years for a diagnosis. And then when you get the diagnosis, you know, of dementia, what type of dementia? So there's somebody I spoke to quite recently, and Francesca referenced him earlier as well. Craig Ritchie, he's the Director of Brain Health in Scotland. He said his mission is to get to the stage when somebody says, you know, a neighbour, you meet a neighbour and say, I've got dementia, that somebody else will be as educated to say, what type and what stage? We do it with cancer all the time. What type of cancer have you got and what stage? And we all understand it. We know what it means. So, you know, to get a diagnosis of dementia isn't really enough. It's not good enough. So now we know, and often I would say, you know, LBD, DBL, there's so many just abbreviations for Lewy body disease. I always call it Lewy body disease or Lewy body disorders, even though Kevin has Lewy body dementia. Because when we say dementia, my own mom had Alzheimer's disease. When you say the word dementia, people say, it's all about memory, because we've done such a good job in Ireland and elsewhere for the last 20 years talking about dementia, and people equate it to memory loss. But in fact, with Lewy body disease, memory is really not the problem. There are so many other problems to deal with. Kevin will outline them all. This is his second book. Here is behind me. His first book is Lewy body dementia, survival and me, which outlines his journey, how he got a diagnosis, how he got a misdiagnosis before that. And this behind me is the sequel. So the sequel is I am Kevin, not Louie. And I think the title says it all. You're not defined by your diagnosis. And also, because there's an exclamation mark there, I'm Kevin, not Louie. You know, it's a book full of hope. It's a book full of, this is me, this is Kevin. This is what I've done since my diagnosis. I've become a writer. I'm an author. I'm a poet. I'm the chair and a co-founder of an organisation, Lewy Body Ireland. We've been tweeting about Lewy Body Ireland for the last 6 or 7 months, and so much so that somebody in Australia, a guy called Steve Coleman, he's a macadamia nut farmer in Queensland in Australia, saw all these tweets, got in touch with Kevin and said, Kevin, I'm a bit like you. I look a bit like you. How did you do it? How did you get started? And this guy, Steve Coleman, has been inspired to set up Lewy Body Dementia Australia. So now we are talking to people, LBDA in America, the Lewy Body Society in the UK, and we're all this Lewy bodies, you know, we're a bunch of people who speak about Lewy bodies all the time. What I'd like to do now is, just before I invite Ira, who's also co-founder of Lewy Body Ireland, speak, I just want to give you an invitation to a kind of a party. It's a Zoom party. We have it every month. It's the third Thursday of every month. It's called Tea Time with Louie. It's informal. It's a chat. You're all welcome to come if you've any interest in Lewy body disease at all, whether you're somebody who's been recently diagnosed or whether you've been living with this disease for years and years, whether you're a caregiver or whether you're somebody who nursed a parent, or it could be your husband or your wife. You're welcome. If you're a researcher like Caoimhe and you want to learn more about what it's really like, you're welcome. If you're a doctor or a nurse or a healthcare practitioner or a medical student and you want to learn what it's like with these informal sessions, you're very welcome. The next session is on Thursday, the 21st of October, and it's our Australia special, our very first. It's 10 o'clock in the morning because it's tea time in Australia. The last time we had it in September, it was tea time for us in Ireland, but it was 2 a.m. in Australia, they still joined. It was 8 a.m. in America, they still joined. So you're all welcome. We're going to share the links. And please join us. It's free and it's a place where you're safe. You can keep your camera off if you want. You don't have to, you don't have to expose yourself if you don't want. You can use the chat box or you can email me privately if you have a question. All of those options are available to you, but do come. It's free and you're welcome. I'd now like to introduce to you Iracema Leroi, professor and co-founder of Lewy Body Ireland.
Thank you very much, Karen, Kevin, and Helena, for that fantastic introduction. And I think my job on the panel today is to share some PowerPoints, as we have to always, and really speak about education. So this is a little bit of an introduction to Lewy body disorders for people on the call who may be less familiar with it. And that's because at Lewy Body Ireland, we want to be absolutely true to our mission, which is to raise knowledge and awareness of this condition, exactly as Kevin was pointing out. So this is going to be very much a clinically oriented talk to help people get a little bit of familiarity with Lewy body disorders, if they're not already. I'm going to touch on the diagnostic criteria for dementia with Lewy bodies, and then touch on the symptom profiles. So first of all, just a little bit of terminology to start off with. We talk about Lewy body spectrum disorders. In other words, this isn't a single condition, it is a spectrum of conditions under which rubric falls the following. First of all, idiopathic Parkinson's disease, which is standard Parkinson's disease as most people are aware of it. People who present with slurred speech, stooped, slow gait, and sometimes a tremor. Also, people who develop mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, in the context of Parkinson's falls under the spectrum. And then we move into more significant cognitive impairment in the form of PDD, or Parkinson's disease dementia, and then DLB, or dementia with Lewy bodies, also called Lewy body dementia. And these two conditions, PDD and DLB, the two dementia forms, form about 15% of all dementias. Now, that is a significant proportion if you think that Alzheimer's disease, the most common form of dementia, constitutes between 60 to 70% of all dementias. Then you can see that Lewy body dementia and PDD together start falling into the second most common form of dementia, and that's something that many people are not aware of. So why is this sometimes a difficult diagnosis to recognize? Well, it's partly because the pathology is spread in various parts of the brain and will present differently depending on where that pathology is. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see here this little key. We've got Lewy bodies, which are the pathological inclusions that are characteristic of this condition, inclusions in the brain, that are in the, first of all, in the brainstem. Then we also get them in the cortex higher up in the brain. But we can also get a significant proportion of people presenting with cortical plaques. Now, cortical plaques are Alzheimer-like pathology. And sometimes we get people with the so-called mixed pathology, that you have the Lewy body pathology plus Alzheimer's pathology in the form of plaques and tangles, and therefore people have a more aggressive course of the condition and may present in a slightly different way. And that's important to keep in mind. So I won't go through this in detail, but as you can see here, in classical Parkinson's disease, here you have these Lewy body pathologies really confined to the brain stem and predominantly presenting with motor and psychiatric presentations such as depression and anxiety. Whereas here, if you start getting Lewy bodies in the brain stem as well as here in the cortex, you're going to present with a wider array of the symptoms. And likewise, once you start developing the Alzheimer pathology as well, as will happen in a proportion of people, more areas of the brain are involved and more symptoms can present. So because of this diverse presentation, we call Lewy body disorders the chameleon of neurodegenerative disorders. And I'm going to run through some of the diagnoses as we go in a minute. But this becomes important clinically because, of course, if people present in different ways, they may end up accessing the health and social care ecosystem in different ways or through different doors. In other words, if you predominantly present with visual hallucinations, you may end up knocking on a psychiatry door. If, on the other hand, you present with falls and syncope, you may end up in a falls clinic. If, on the other hand, you present with Parkinsonism or tremors, you may end up in neurology, or you may even have an acute attack of lightheadedness and end up with a fall and end up in A&E. So again, it depends which door you end up in, and many times these doors don't link up with corridors behind the doors, and therefore it can be problematic that people may not receive the comprehensive multidisciplinary care that is required. And this really is the crux of why we need to raise awareness and education about this condition. I'll draw your attention to the official criteria, most recently published in 2017, and this is an evolved version that has developed over many years under the leadership of Professor Ian McKeith from Newcastle. And these criteria are called the diagnosis and management of Lewy bodies under this particular report. And essentially, the diagnosis can be made when dementia occurs before or concurrently with Parkinsonism. So that's an important point. However, keep in mind that not everybody with DLB presents with Parkinsonism or the Parkinson's-like syndrome. We can either diagnose this as being probable or possible DLB. Generally, when we talk about dementia, we only talk about definite diagnosis in the pathological state. In other words, when we look at a person's brain in autopsy. But whether it's possible or probable depends on the number of different core or supportive features that one presents with. And the core features can be clinical, but they can also present with what we call indicative biomarkers. So biomarkers are certain changes that we see either on neuroimaging or other diagnostic modalities. And that's quite important because we need the combination of the two, the clinical presentation as well as the biomarkers, to really understand what's going on with the condition. So one of the key things here is that when we look at the dementia syndrome, we think of this, of course, as being defined as a progressive cognitive decline. But it has to be of sufficient magnitude to interfere with your daily social or occupational functions. If your cognitive difficulties are not severe enough to interfere significantly with your life, then we tend not to call it dementia. We tend to call it cognitive impairment or mild cognitive impairment. And in the case of people with Lewy body pathology, they can have that pathology and have Lewy body disease, but may not quite yet reach the point of dementia. In which case, we refer to people as having prodromal Lewy body dementia or prodromal Lewy body disease. So what kind of presentation does the cognitive impairment look like? Now, it's a little bit different to typical presentations of Alzheimer's disease. Karen was mentioning that we typically think of dementia or people presenting to memory clinics as having memory disorders. But in the case of DLB or Lewy body diseases, people tend to present with executive dysfunction. So executive dysfunction or your executive abilities are essentially your ability to do exactly that, to manage your life, the executive aspects. So that's planning, that's about being flexible in your thinking, it's about multitasking. So if you think of all the things that, for example, a personal assistant needs to do at any one point, they might be checking an email, they might be having somebody knock on the door, they might be working on a document, and the phone might go off. So the switching set and attention between all these different things, and they're planning for the future, and they're keeping things organized. That's an example of executive function. And when you cannot do that, your life becomes quite difficult, and you feel very confused, and you present with brain fog, and often that then is misinterpreted as having a memory disorder. People can also present with visual spatial problems, difficulty figuring out the relationship of objects. And this may manifest in various ways. For example, putting things in the wrong place in the cupboard, not remembering where things are, having difficulty putting an IKEA flat pack together, these kinds of issues. Also, attention may be difficult. Attentional disorders present with, for example, difficulty following the plot of a story because you're not following it through or paying attention to all the details, reading a newspaper article through to the end, and so on. And finally, recall difficulties. So whereas in typical Alzheimer's disease, a person may have difficulty with encoding information, in other words, actually getting the information into their brain and having it stick, very often in the earlier stages of the Lewy body disorders, the information goes in and it sticks. In other words, it does encode, but it has difficulty finding its way out again. In other words, it's the recall that's a problem. It's the second part of that. So what that means is that if you provide cues or clues or memory aids, then the information will come out because it's actually very often in there already. And that can be a real advantage. So thinking about the hope aspect, that's a good thing because it means we can put things in place like memory aids and cues in order to help people with what they perceive as a memory problem. So here's an example of somebody with Lewy body with visual spatial difficulties, or many people actually. So you can see how the task here is to copy these intersecting pentagons and people have tremendous difficulty doing this. Their brains cannot quite interpret what the shape is and reproduce it. And this, of course, manifests with tremendous difficulties in day-to-day life. And also what's important, that if a person is having visual spatial difficulties, driving becomes a very important issue that needs to be addressed. Because to drive successfully, we need to be able to navigate ourselves in relation to other objects, particularly other vehicles. So I'm going to move through the range of symptoms here that people may present with to give people a flavor of this chameleon condition. So what about Parkinsonism? So whether this is very often part of the core features, but not everybody presents with Parkinsonism. And this is where sometimes we can be led astray because we don't think that people have Lewy body because they don't have the typical kind of tremors or shakes. Keep in mind that for those that do present with Parkinsonism, it's often a little bit different from what we see in people with plain Parkinson's disease or idiopathic Parkinson's disease. In other words, very often in this case with Lewy bodies, the tremor is not there. So it's called tremor non-dominant or akinetic rigid type syndrome. What that means is that people tend to be stiff and slow. That's a bradykinetic rather than having tremor. And also this tends to be less responsive to the Parkinson's type medications. Another condition that's very common is REM sleep behavior disorder. And this is whereby the typical atonia or paralysis that you should have during your REM sleep disappears. So when the monsters are chasing after us in our dreams, we typically lie still and sleep and don't respond. If, on the other hand, you don't have that normal paralysis or atonia, you will start running away or kicking back and fighting with the monsters, which means you'll be flailing around in your sleep, shouting out, and often for the bed partner, this can be hugely problematic. So just this week, I had a patient who presented, and turns out that he had kicked his wife so badly as a result of these vivid dreams that she needed to have significant medical interventions for an injury from the kick. Sometimes people throw themselves onto the ground so they can injure themselves as well. What's interesting about REM sleep behavior disorder is that this condition often predates the onset of the rest of the clinical syndrome by many years, sometimes up to 20 years. Fluctuating alertness and confusion, one of the core features. This is Helena's Irish weather. In other words, things can present with somebody being very confused, having difficult rambling speech, lots of hallucinations. And at other times, they may be bright, alert, lucid. And sometimes this can cause a lot of confusion. Sometimes we have families saying, it looks like they're putting it on, because we can have a really good day when the person presents very well, and other times they just seem off somewhere else. And so this is one of the challenges that we see in this condition. Visual hallucinations are very often a hallmark feature, and for people who present at later age with visual hallucinations, after ruling out key reversible factors or acute medical conditions, we need to be thinking about Lewy body. These can often be very frightening. They'll be mixed with illusions. So an illusion is whereby you look at something and it kind of takes shape and you see something else in it. Whereas a hallucination is where you see something that isn't there with no stimulus at all. These can be complex, they can be recurrent. Very often they might be of corpses of dead relatives. It might be animals, children coming to tea, people sitting around the table. Sometimes it takes the form of these visual hallucinations being crowds of people following a person into their intimate spaces, such as their bathrooms. And then some people present with misidentification syndromes, which can be extremely upsetting and frightening for the person experiencing it, as well as the person who is the subject of being misidentified. And this is what we call a Capgras syndrome, which can occur in about 1/5 of people with this condition. And Capgras is a recurrent and transient belief that a familiar person, usually a close family member like the spouse, has been replaced by an identical looking imposter. Which means that the person receiving care may not engage with it. They'll say, no, go away. I don't know you. I want my wife back. Bring her here. I will do X, Y, and Z for her. What have you done with her? And that can be very disorienting and frightening. And sometimes it can lead to the person who's experiencing this even attacking the person they believe is an imposter. just going to move on in the interest of time. A very important and challenging aspect of Lewy body is, of course, autonomic dysfunction, or ANS dysfunction, dysautonomia. And this is where we get damage to the nerves of the autonomic nervous system. And this is part of the system that regulates very many involuntary physiological functions: heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, digestion, and sexual arousal. So this means that people might present with years before the onset of the rest of the syndrome with constipation, bladder problems, blood pressure drops leading to falls and dizziness, sexual dysfunction, and so on. So just to conclude, so which door does a person with DLB enter? I hope that increasingly they'll enter the Lewy Body Ireland door so that they can receive information as our organization grows, learn about this condition, raise knowledge and awareness within the public as well as amongst professionals so that people can receive care and support earlier. And finally, just to draw people's attention to one of our initiatives, this is called Lewy Body Academy. We'll be running our first one in a few weeks from now up in Belfast. And this is to train professionals in the practical and day-to-day care of people living with Lewy body dementia. And if it's successful, I hope we will run this masterclass again and make it available to more professionals going forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks. That was a lot of information that's really valuable to everybody to understand better what people like Kevin are going through. I'd like to ask Caoimhe now to present or talk. I think you've got some slides too, Caoimhe.
I do. I will share my screen. Hi, everyone. Caoimhe Tyndall is my name, and I am a PhD student at Trinity College, Dublin. And just today, I'll kind of share with you the topic of my research, which is using cell models to understand the underlying mechanisms behind Lewy body disorders. So as you know, as other people have spoken about earlier today, Lewy bodies are large clumps of damaged or misfolded proteins, and they form over time inside of the brain and the spinal cord and the peripheral nervous system of people who are living with Lewy body diseases. And one of these damaged proteins that makes up a large component of Lewy bodies themselves is called alpha-synuclein. And under certain conditions, alpha-synuclein can become mutated. And when it gets mutated as a protein, it's got the tendency to kind of clump together and form these different shapes or conformations. And when mutated alpha-synuclein clumps together, it can form monomers or oligomers. When it clumps up even more, that can build up to become protofibrils, build up even more to become fibrils, and eventually sort of aggregate to the point where they become a major component of the Lewy body. So this whole process here that you can see by which alpha-synuclein becomes mutated and then clumps together to form these larger order molecules is referred to as aggregation of the protein. So once these aggregated forms of alpha-synuclein get inside neurons, they can spread from cell to cell, and they can spread really all throughout the brain. And as more and more cells become disrupted by this synuclein buildup, they can become damaged and eventually result in cell death. So when these neurons die as a result of this synuclein buildup particularly, they release what we call cytokines or inflammatory molecules. And when they become released, this kind of signals to the cells of the rest of the brain to come and clean up the debris that, comes from cell death. So the purpose of my research is to try and find a way to target this cell death and try and stop it. But of course, by the time these Lewy bodies get inside the cells, it's quite tricky to intervene at this point. So instead of sort of focusing my research on these Lewy bodies themselves, the purpose of my research really is to kind of focus on its precursor, which is the alpha-synuclein fibril. And we are doing this kind of in hopes of intervening at an earlier stage before the aggregation starts and before these Lewy bodies set inside the neurons, in hopes that we can sort of intervene earlier and control the cell death that we see over here, and of course control the symptoms of Lewy body diseases from getting out of hand. So the way that we think we can sort of target this cell death induced by synuclein aggregates, specifically the fibrils, is through the process of neuroinflammation. And neuroinflammation involves another type of cell in the brain, which is called microglia. Microglia are sort of the resident immune cells of the brain, if you will, and just as immune cells in the rest of the body would, a microglia's job is to sort of survey the surrounding environment and keep an eye out for any damaged proteins or cell debris or pathogens that may have crossed into the brain. And they do this with these sort of finger-like ramifications, we call them. But when microglia are in this sort of resting state, just monitoring the environment, they're just said to be in a resting state. But when they recognize something foreign, like a dead cell or an invading pathogen like a bacteria or a mutated protein like a fibril, for example, microglia can shift from this resting state into what we call an activated state. And in doing this, they sort of retract those processes that you can see, and they take this balloon-like morphology. And so activated microglia, when they take this balloon-like shape, they then release what we call pro-inflammatory molecules, or cytokines, as I was saying before. And they can signal to the rest of the brain. They're messages that get secreted by these cells that signal to the rest of the brain, really to get rid of the pathogen that this microglia has found by ingesting it itself, but also by destroying any of the other cells that have been infected by the pathogen. So our neurons, for example, that you saw earlier. But of course, as you've seen, this sort of cell death that the alpha-synuclein causes in the first place, in and of itself can cause the release of microglial activators. And once you have excess microglial activation, that promotes the further release of more neurotoxic factors, which then causes more cell death. And the cycle kind of goes on. So it's this continuous cycle between neurodegeneration and neuroinflammation that shows this toxic relationship that can go on inside of a brain that is overwhelmed by alpha-synuclein. So in our lab, we can recreate this relationship between neurons and glia, this idea of neurodegeneration and neuroinflammation being so tightly related and induced by alpha-synuclein. We can look at this in the lab using a technique called cell culture. And we use these cell cultures to sort of test different treatment strategies for combating alpha-synuclein-induced inflammation and subsequent neurodegeneration. So using tissues from rat brains, this is a rat brain here, it's about the size of a grape. We can isolate microglia from this brain tissue and grow them in plastic plates. And this is what a microglia looks like. If you look at it under a microscope, you can see all the ramifications here are, jutting out from the cell body. We can then manually induce their activation by throwing on a bunch of fibrils onto the plate. And we can collect the neurotoxic factors that they release and transfer those neurotoxic factors onto a plate of neuronal cells that we've also grown in the lab. And we can then measure how the neurons react basically to these neurotoxic factors from the microglia. And so when we have this cell model, as we call it, perfected, we should be able to see the same neuronal damage in these plates as we see in the Lewy body brain. So at this point, we have made sort of a representative model, if you will, of at least one part of the Lewy body brain. And using it, we can sort of look at ways to intervene and to combat this inflammation and prevent microglia from becoming overactivated and, of course, in turn, causing the degeneration of neurons. So one way we think we can suppress this chronic microglial activation, and this is based off of studies not only from our lab, but other labs across the world who have been publishing literature in this area, is by targeting a specific receptor that's expressed on microglial cells. and this is called the beta-2 Adreno receptor. And we want to target this receptor with a specific class of drugs, which are the beta-2 Adreno receptor agonists. And the mechanism through which these drugs work when they activate their receptors on microglial cells results basically in having anti-inflammatory properties, and as such kind of have the ability to mediate synuclein-induced microglial activation and therefore keep this degeneration at bay. And slow the degeneration really is what it is. So now that you sort of have an idea of the direction of my research and the setup of my experiments in the lab, I will hopefully be able to present some actual results and show you the effect of this drug on the neurons and on the microglia at a later date. So thank you for listening, for inviting me to speak, and I'm happy to take any questions to the best of my ability. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Caoimhe. And now I'm going to turn over to Ken.
Hi, Kim. Thanks very much. And thank you for this very important platform to speak about Lewy body dementia and also Lewy body Ireland. Every time I listen to Caoimhe and Iracema speak, I learn something new about Lewy body dementia. And so that for me really highlights how important this information is in today's age. So to pick up on a point that Karen had made earlier about memory, my dad is Dave. You see him here in the background. He's 69. He has Lewy body dementia. So in relation to memory, when I tell people my dad has Lewy body dementia, the first question they tend to ask me is, does he know you? And my response, as always, is now, I wish he didn't know me. Because if my dad didn't know me, then he wouldn't have to experience some of the cruel and torturous symptoms that he does daily living with Lewy body dementia. I suppose also to pick up on Kevin's point in relation to, the awareness that's out there at the moment. I mean, this isn't something that people haven't known about in the past. This is real time. People are very unaware of Lewy body dementia. And unfortunately, those people are sometimes the people who we rely on most, which are the medical professionals. That's through no fault of their own. We totally understand and accept that. I suppose that's what we hope to achieve. That's what we hope to achieve through Lewy body, to support the professionals to understand Lewy body dementia more. Only recently, I spoke to a very progressive GP in his 40s, and I told him about Lewy body dementia. And his answer was to me that Lewy body dementia can only really be diagnosed in post-mortem. I mean, this was obviously quite concerning to me, who experienced a very tough journey with my dad. I mean, the pre-diagnosis of all the symptoms that are there, are ways of diagnosing Lewy bodies. And I suppose in today's society, there are medical professionals who are unaware of that, My dad's journey has gone on for probably now 11 years. He's been misdiagnosed, misprescribed, misunderstood. It took us 7 years to get a diagnosis of Lewy bodies. And throughout that time, he was prescribed the wrong medications. He had no supports. Nobody knew how to help him. And I suppose what's really important to me is the last 11 years, if they weren't motivation enough to become part of Lewy body Ireland, it's just this year alone that has really confirmed that to me. I'd just like to take a few minutes to explain about this year and why it's so important for me. So at the start of this year, my dad would have had several falls due to his mobility issues. Dad's Lewy bodies infects all parts of his brain. He suffers from motor functions. He suffers from hallucinations, persecutory delusions and hallucinations, suffers from speech, incontinence, fear, paranoia. So he suffers all parts of his brain with Lewy bodies. At the start of this year, he had several falls requiring stitches and medical intervention. His mobility and his speech was very poor. It had come to the stage in March of this year that, I considered the effect that, how do I keep my dad safe? And I was considering, do we sedate him? Is there any other way to keep him safe from falling? I suppose in the second half of this year, we were very lucky enough to get Dad under the care of Professor Leroi, who spoke earlier. And for me, it never highlights why Lewy body Ireland is so important today. Since being under the care of Professor Leroi, my dad now is out watering flowers. He's laughing and joking more. He's able to play a game of cards for the first time in years. this for me never ever has highlighted the importance of Lewy Body Ireland and the necessity that we are here to try help and support and provide information to people, and not just the people who are dealing with the tragedy of Lewy body disease or their families, but for the professionals and the health professionals and the clinicians who need the information and the knowledge on how to diagnose and treat Lewy bodies. Yeah, my dad may have gone too long. He's 11 years in. He may never recover to an extent where I can know him as the dad I used to know him, but he now has moments of peace. And that's due to the knowledge and expertise of Professor Leroi. So it is out there, and we in Lewy Body Ireland we hope to achieve this. And I suppose that hope has never been so apparent as it is in the eyes of the people here speaking today. You know, we have so much hope through Lewy Body Ireland as we listen to Kevin and Helena through their lived experience told so powerfully. That's going to help and change people's lives for the future. We have the hope through Karen as she expertly connects and communicates people all over the world to make Lewy Body Ireland a centre of excellence. Hope through Iracema and her academy that she's there to educate and support and advise clinicians on how to identify Lewy body illness far sooner so that the people who need it most can get the help when they need it. And we have hope through Quaid that her research may in the future provide some medicines and cures to help understand and deal with Lewy Body Ireland. But we also ask for the hope of all the people who are listening to this seminar today that we get together and we support each other. And that includes patients, families, clinicians, doctors, and everyone who may feel that Lewy body is part of their lives. And as a society, it's up to us to make that difference. So look, I'd just like to conclude this by saying, and Kevin had made a point to me earlier in the week, you know, and he pointed out that it's the likes of my dad, who is a co-founder of Lewy Body Ireland. I am a co-founder in name only. I am fortunate enough to have a voice for my dad and all the other dads and moms and brothers and sisters and partners and loved ones out there. It's their voice and their lived experience that is ultimately going to help shape Lewy Body Ireland. And in doing so, we hope that what we are trying to achieve is going to create a pathway for people and professionals and anybody who needs that help and support, that we can ultimately make the diagnosis of Lewy body disease a little bit easier to live with. So I thank you for your time. I'll pass you back to you now, Kim.
Thank you so much, Ken. And it's so nice to hear about your father being able to enjoy things again. And I'm sure it makes the world of difference to you and the family.
Absolutely.
Very good. So we have some questions coming in. So I'll throw the question to the panel, and then there's some that are very specific and some that I think people can, you know, help each other answer. So one has come up. How can people get more information about Lewy body? Do you guys have a website?
Yes, we're building a website at the moment. Thanks, Kim, for asking that. And in fact, our website, we're very excited about it. So the website is going to appeal to 5 different types of people. Front and center, I mentioned it before, I'm going to say it again. Kevin Quaid and all the Kevin Quaids that are out there. We estimate that there are probably about 10,000 people in Ireland living with Lewy body disease. They may not have a diagnosis yet. It may not be detected, but 10,000 people is an estimate of the 64,000 people in Ireland who will be diagnosed with dementia. And the stats, which are really robust in the USA and in the UK and in Australia, 15 to 20% of all of those people have Lewy body disease. So there's 10,000 people in Ireland. Who are they? Where are they? We need to find them. So there's going to be a section on our website just for Kevin and all the Kevins and all the Daves who have Lewy body disease. So it's for, we're going to call it just for the patient, just as a descriptive word of where the first thing you get a diagnosis, where do you go, that part. The second part of the website is for Helena and for Ken and for all the Helenas and all the Kens, which there must be another 10,000 of those or more. Families, neighbours, friends. How do you support? How do you do peer-to-peer support? And we're building that one in conjunction with this wonderful woman from LBDA, which is the Lewy Body Dementia Association in America. Her name is Helen Metzger. So Helen Metzger, you might see her name at the back of my screen here. She's also an editor. And this is Kevin's book, I'm Kevin Not Louie, edited by Helen Metzger. Helen Metzger has 3 members of her family who she cared for. Her dad, her older sister, and her younger brother. So she's an absolute expert on peer-to-peer support. So we're building that section with Helen. The third section is for clinicians, being built by Iracema and her colleagues. All the clinicians, where do they go for information? The fourth one is for the researchers, and that's being built by our lovely colleague here, Quaid. So where do all the researchers go? There's so much research already out there. You just don't know where to look. So we're hoping that our website is going to be like a signpost. This is where you go. This is how you'll find it. And Quaid and Andrew Harkin in Trinity College are building that part of the website. And the fifth one, the one I'm really excited about, is where do creative artists come into the picture? Where are all the people who offer hope, you know, for gardening, for joining a choir, for writing groups, for walking groups, for socializing? You know, where do you all go to paint? Where do you all go when you have got a diagnosis? You don't just hang around and wait to get your affairs in order. That's going to take forever, you know. So what do you do next? So that's the fifth and the really lovely part of our website. So it's being built at the moment. Hope's on the way. And in the meantime, we've got Twitter. So at Lewy Body IRL or at Karen Meenan 3, or you can follow any one of us here as well. Ken, Kevin, Helena, Quaid, Ira, we're all on Twitter.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Karen. So the next question is, people are asking, is Kevin's new book available for sale already? And somebody here wants to know if they can get signed copies and how.
Yeah, it's not, it's actually going to print either this evening or tomorrow evening. So it should be on Amazon come early next week, but I will have signed copies available. But can I just take one minute? And we've called it Lewy Body Ireland. Specifically, we have left out the word dementia. And Ken's dad, Dave, I want to explain something to everyone. I think it's a powerful message that not all dementias are memory related. I didn't know Dave growing up. I didn't play soccer with him. I didn't play sport with him. I didn't go for a pint with him. The first time I met Dave was when he was in the care facility. The first day I met him, Dave is 6 years further on my journey. I broke down and cried and I walked away because I could see it was like looking into the mirror. This is where I'm going. That was hard for me. And I left that day and I came back and I met him a couple of times after, and he was delighted to meet me. And we actually had a night out together in Baldwin Castle, and then COVID struck. And I didn't meet Dave again for nearly 2 years. And Ken and Helena and myself were in Caoimhe 2 weeks ago. And I was going to meet Dave, and Ken said to me, he may not even know you and he may not even talk to you. And we walked in, Nisha, Joy said, Kevin Quaid is here, and Dave's head was down. He looked up and he smiled. I said, Kevin Quaid, I thought I'd never again see you. And he put his 2 hands around me. And 3 days later, Ken's beautiful wife, Claire, she walked in and she said, she was talking to him. He told her that Kevin Quaid had called. He told her that Kevin Quaid was writing a new book. And he asked her, I wonder, has he mentioned my name in his new book? So for anyone thinks that the main problem with Lewy body dementia is memory, forget about it. The rest of your body is going to break down first. And that is why Dave is such an inspiration to me to keep going, keep going, keep going. Thanks.
Lovely, Kevin.
But there will be signed copies available, by the way. Getting back to the question.
And I hear there's a book launch too and a tour.
Yeah, there is a tour. We're organizing a tour. We're organizing a book launch, and hopefully I will have some in Belfast at the conference Iracema was talking about. But my email is there. Anyone that wants to sign copy, just send me the email and I'll arrange to get it to you.
Very good, Kevin. So Quaid, we've gotten a question about a drug called, I'm going to mispronounce this, formoterol. Could you give us some information about that and the potential benefits of taking it?
Yes, but it is not a drug for Lewy body disease currently. So
Okay.
Not to be confused with promoting taking it in any way. But this is the drug that I was describing in the presentation as as a possible drug to target receptors on these microglial cells to hopefully stop the inflammation. So we are working on looking at a few different interventions in the lab to see what kind of specifically drugs, just purely because I work in a pharmacology lab, although other people in the world are looking at different interventions like, sound waves and physical exercise, this kind of thing. But so one of the drugs that is out there, which is this drug formoterol, just is very interesting to look at specifically in this case of Lewy body diseases and other diseases where alpha-synuclein aggregation is a problem in the brain. So Parkinson's disease is another one. And of course, there are a couple of others, but purely because the way that this drug and other types of these drugs, the beta-2 adrenal receptor agonists work, is that they can sort of help promote this anti-inflammatory property throughout the brain. And I think what's kind of well known in particularly the area of Parkinson's disease, probably less so in Lewy body disease, is that the kind of first population of neurons to go, if you will, are these dopaminergic neurons. That's kind of what everybody, relates to when they hear of alpha-synuclein aggregation. And of course, when you lose your dopaminergic neurons, this leads to a subset of symptoms, mostly related to movement symptoms. But what's a little bit less known is that also in these diseases, when alpha-synuclein can aggregate, you lose another subset of neurons, which are called the neurodegenerative neurons. And they are responsible for a whole bunch of different normal involuntary processes that happen to your brain. But the neurodegenerative subset of neurons and the neurotransmitter that they sort of secrete and send messages through the signal are very, very important in the inflammatory state of the brain as well. So when you lose the neurodegenerative neurons, you lose your endogenous capability to keep the brain at a natural anti-inflammatory state, if you will. So then once you lose your noradrenaline, the brain becomes in this pro-inflammatory state. And if you can think back to that sort of circle, that sort of, arrow that I showed in my presentation, saying that the more inflammation you get, the more neurodegeneration you get, and this cycle kind of continues. So this is the idea, is that if we use one of these drugs that sort of mimics what noradrenaline would have done in the brain had it not been destroyed by alpha-synuclein, you can sort of replicate that process using a drug to target that. So that's kind of the main reason, is because it has the potential to combat alpha-synuclein-induced neurodegeneration. And the other thing is that the drug is not a new drug. I'm not developing any sort of new drug. This is a currently marketed drug for asthma and COPD. And so I think one of the benefits of looking into this drug, as opposed to starting to develop a whole new thing, is that we know that it's on the market. We know that people use it. It's safe, it's efficacious, and it's used by a variety of different people at different doses and for extended periods of time. So it's sort of, we sort of skip that whole step of having to go through clinical trials and, seeing if it's safe and efficacious, which I think is a huge benefit of looking into drugs of this sort of type. So hopefully that is a clear explanation of why this is the star in my research, as opposed to developing a new drug, and gives an explanation about why it's so interesting to look at.
Very good. And it's nice to see someone so passionate about their work.
Because of this team that I'm working with.
So the next question that's come in, I think I'm going to send this one to Helena and then Ken, because of things that Kevin has said to me. So he said, if you want to know what it's like to live with Lewy body, ask Helena. So Helena and Ken, can you give us some insights into being a family member / care partner for someone with Lewy body?
Okay, I suppose as a spousal carer, I see Kevin's Lewy body disorder 24/7. And I suppose at the beginning, when he was first diagnosed, I was in denial, obviously, and it was, as time went on, I moved into acceptance. But I actually believed that bearing fatigue stoically was a mark of the virtuous. Therefore, I covered that up. I didn't ask for help soon enough. And there were times that I was sleepwalking during the day because I missed out on so much sleep at night because of Kevin's horrific nightmares. Therefore, as time has moved on, I have definitely learned how to deal with it much better and to look after myself, because it is very important for carers in general to have hobbies. It's a very simple thing. But a lot of carers have none. I'm just very lucky. I live in the country, we have a lovely garden, and I certainly look at that as a hobby, and I meet friends for coffee and at this stage. But at the beginning, I was very slow to go out, and our world got smaller because Kevin no longer drove and he didn't work. So his world got smaller, therefore I allowed my world to get smaller. So it's really important for carers to look after themselves and see that life is for living for both of us, and we really have to live it and live it the best we can. Thank you. Ken?
Well, thanks, Helena. So I suppose my experience, as you know, when you're a parent, you become a parental carer. So it's a bit different in the sense that, you know, effectively what Lewy body dementia does is it makes your parent your child. And I suppose that's a very hard thing to try to establish or accept, or, you know, find a way to navigate your way through. For me, what really haunts me, I suppose, about Lewy body dementia specifically is in relation to the doubts. You know, we speak about the fluctuations, and Iracema and Quaid touch upon the chameleon nature of Lewy body dementia. And I suppose as a carer, that's a very hard thing to rationalize, to understand, and also to relate to other people when you don't understand it yourself. I mean, I've often spoke about the doubts that I had in myself. Did I believe? Did I see what I saw? And did I hear what I heard? You know, am I making up what happened? And that's quite torturous while you're trying to figure out and navigate the journey, but also the doubts that other people have of the person dealing with Lewy bodies. You obviously want to protect them. You see, you know what you're seeing is real, but the other person hasn't seen it or has never encountered it. And you then have to try convince them. And then, of course, there's the doubts that people have of the person with Lewy bodies themselves. You know, are they making this up? You know, are they exaggerating? And that's a very cruel thing to have to try deal with as a carer, because, you know, you're seeing what the person is going through, but you're also after trying to fend off these doubts from other people. I would like to say, first of all, I suppose Lewy body dementia has, you know, it has a large effect as a carer. I mean, it's quite, you know, it's quite taxing on your own spirit and your own soul. And I've suffered my own health mentally and physically. And, you know, it's not something to be ever taken lightly. You know, I just had a little story about a time that there was a girl I was seeing previous before my dad, and he had Lewy bodies before we knew, when we met years on. And she asked me a question. She goes, "Oh, one of the reasons we broke up is because you brought your dad out on our first Valentine's Day dinner." And I suppose that's what Lewy body, and that's what caring for a person who you love does. You don't see past the reality of situations. All you want to do is protect your loved one. And when it comes to Lewy bodies and the whole misdiagnosis underneath it, that becomes harder because you don't know what you're dealing with. So I suppose being a carer, as Helena has very well pointed out, is so important that you have the support and the care for yourself. And I suppose, look, Lewy body and any illness that anyone here on this panel or anybody listening has dealt with can ultimately help you to understand people in the world a little bit better. And I suppose as we go on in this journey, I suppose hopefully, you know, we'll all essentially be able to help each other more as we move forward.
Thanks very much, Ken. So the next question that's come in, this one's for you, Kevin, but I don't know, I'll leave it to you if you want to answer and how you want to answer, but they're asking you about your hallucinations and like how your Lewy body has progressed. So I will turn it over to you to share what you want to share.
Well, with the hallucinations, they're in form of when I'm awake and alive like this. So I'm on, I think the pronunciation is Benizapal for them, and they help quite a lot. So by day, I don't have them very often, but I remember one particular day when I said to Helena was driving, for God's sake, will you keep in from, it was a silver Ford Escort that I saw, but there was no car there. That's how real it was. But the hallucinations that come at night from the nighttime terrors, when you wake in the middle of the night and like Professor Iracema has shown, when she spoke about the corpses, I've moved corpses in my sleep. I've smelt corpses in my sleep, to the point that I was up one morning, I think Helena, correct me if I'm wrong, around 11 o'clock, and Helena had to go to the health food shop at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to get orange essence oil to put at the bottom of my nose, right here, to take away the smell of the corpse. I've never in my life smelled a corpse, but I did that night. And you wake, I can wake and I won't know who I am. I won't know where I am and who the hell is that person alongside me. And it's only Helena's voice that I will see. But the one thing I will plead with you, and I'll use the story of the cat that I've used 1,000 times. If you're with me and I tell you I see a cat, don't tell me there's no cat there, because I can see him. Maybe you're the ones hallucinating, maybe you're the one that can't see the cat. But ask, do I like cats? And if I do, then that will encourage a story to talk about cats in the future. If I don't like cats, open the door, try to hunt out this cat you can't see and ask, is the cat gone? But likewise, and it was at the Engaging Dementia conference I spoke at in Court Park a couple of years ago. A person from a care home facility came to me and she said that there is one of their patients, he constantly sees this guy with a dagger. What should I say to him? Well, I said, if you say there's no one there with a dagger, if that was me, I will automatically assume you're siding with him. You know he's there, you can see him, and you want him to kill me. But if you say to me, as long as I'm with you, you're safe. You know, that's all any of us want to be, is safe. And these hallucinations hurt us. And I know what Dave is going through. I know what Ken's dad is going through. Only probably 1,000 times worse. And that's why we have so much fear. And I'm never afraid to talk about him. What I will say is that any of you there that don't have this horrible disease, your worst nightmare multiplied by 1,000. And it becomes so real, it's as real as talking to you guys today. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for sharing. So the last question that's come in, and I'm going to open it up to anybody who wants to answer, and we can take multiple answers, is what can each of us do to get the word out? What do you want us to do starting today?
I'm going to start here, and I'm going to say what I said at the beginning. We need to get into schools. We need to start at possibly leaving cert or below it. And if nurses and doctors, when they go to college, it's not an if and or but, it's a must. There has to be a specific module on dementia, end of story. I know there's 400 different types of dementias that need to be made aware of, but the top 50 at least in every hospital shows that the likes of Dave and the likes of Kevin in 5 or 10 years' time, when the new nurses come out and the new doctors come out, that they know what Lewy body dementia is, they know what vascular, they know what front temporal lobe, they know what Alzheimer's is. That is where we have to begin, because if the medical professions don't know, how are we going to be treated? That's my response.
And my response is just keep talking about it. And we are trying to normalize living with Louie, and that's why we have our tea times with Louie. We're trying to make it that, you know, there's so much fear involved in this disease, as you can tell from Kevin and from Helena. But a lot of that is at nighttime. So during the daytime, while people are up and about and walking, there's one weird part about Lewy body disease, which I hadn't been aware of until I met Kevin and obviously Ken and all the other people who have Lewy body disease, are the fluctuations. So during an hour, you can have a perfectly fine 50 minutes and then 10 minutes things go haywire. Or during a whole day, you can have a perfectly fine day talking about normal stuff and then an hour things go mad. Or you can have a perfectly fine week and have a bad day in a week. You know, so this is the whole thing about Lewy body disease, is to be believed. a lot of people think you're codding. I know Helena has said that people have said to her, Kevin's not as bad as you let on he is. I saw him in the pub last week. He was fine. He was then, but he wasn't when Helena said he wasn't fine. So it's the whole thing, to support people who live with Lewy body disease. First of all, let's please talk about it, remove some of the stigma. And yes, please believe them. If they say they're having a terrible time and if they can see a cat or a dog or a silver escort, that's what they see and that's their belief. So, I suppose the whole thing is that it's not for us to understand the disease. We've got people like Quaid and Iracema who try and explain it to us, but it's for us to believe the people while they say it, we should believe it. So I suppose if you're asking me the question of what can we do to help, believe, follow us on Twitter. Please like and share some of our posts. There's amazing stuff that's out there. What we're trying to do is just share it everywhere. So the more people who get it and share it, the better. And then, please keep it nice and light as well. Join us for Tea Time with Louie, very informal chats where we talk about all sorts of mad stuff, and you get all sorts of mad questions. There's always a researcher, there's always a scientist, there's always a doctor on the call as well. So if you have a real question that you are afraid to ask your own GP or your own doctor, this is a really good time to ask it as well. It's all very informal. And it's free.
I just like to follow in there, and I just like to say that I suppose it's up to us all, really, and especially carers and loved ones of your family members who you feel may be experiencing some form of dementia, whether it be Lewy bodies or any type, to challenge the status quo. Believe what you believe, know what you know. I suppose now since the pandemic, the world has never become so smaller and people are able to communicate and connect so easily. It's up to us all to support each other, to share information, to inspire each other, to encourage each other, to educate each other, because this could affect each and every one of us and has and will do in time to come. And it's up to each and every one of us to pull together and continue to have these platforms, have these fantastic seminars and webinars and get the information out there, because for as many people are at these events, that information can be shared to another person and another person. And that's how it's going to change. It's going to change by people speaking up. And just to follow up, I spoke at the Global Brain Health Institute conference recently, and I came off that call and I was never so impressed by how many experts that are out there talking to each other and helping each other to get the answers. But what I do feel is necessary at this juncture is that people who have the lived experience, the carers, the patients, to come together, to have a voice, to be heard, because through the lived experience is where really we'll find the answers in how to move forward effectively with any form of dementia. And as a society, again, I have to echo that, as Francesca mentioned earlier in her seminar, it's up to society as a whole to come together to make effective change for the people who are suffering the most.
Just to reiterate, Kim, something that you said earlier. If you want to know what it's like to have Lewy body dementia, you ask me because I have it. But if you want to know what it's like to live with it, then you ask the person you're living with, because they're the ones that are living with it.
Very good. Well, we'll end with Kevin having the last word. So thank you all for coming along to the panel. That was really interesting, very informative, and we will push to have this video edited among the first and get it out there and send it to you, obviously, so you can send it through your networks as well. So well, just one last question there. Are you guys available for talks in nursing homes?
100%.
Very good. Lovely.
I mean, I have been vaccinated. I have my passport. I travel anywhere.
Very good.
And Kim, can we just say an enormous thank you to you and to your team for allowing us to have this platform today. We're so very, very grateful that you've allowed us this huge amount of time to talk about Lewy body disease. And for everyone who joined on the panel today and all the participants, we are very grateful that you stayed for this length of time to learn a little bit about Lewy body disease. So we're just saying from us to all of you, thank you, a massive thank you from us.
Thanks. I know that I speak for everybody that has been listening to you guys for the last while. It's been fascinating, and yeah, very happy to have you along.